He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora, ko William Ray tēnei. Nau mai ngā hipi pāngo. Hi there, I'm William Ray. Welcome to Black Sheep and the second in our two-part story of Thomas Kendall. In our last episode, we explained how Kendall started out as one of the very first missionaries in the Bay of Islands in 1814. We talked about his role trading muskets to Māori, especially the Ngapuhi Rangatira Hongi Hika. And we discussed how, in 1820, Kendall defied the orders of Samuel Marsden and insisted on leaving Aotearoa and sailing with Hongi Hika and another rangatira named Waikato to England. Now, in this episode, we're telling the story of that voyage and the catastrophes which followed it. Travelling with an alien people to their alien homeland must have been pretty daunting for Hongi Hika and Waikato. Just imagine sailing up the Thames, seeing all those big brick buildings surrounding you. Their lifeline in all this was Thomas Kendall, their translator and sort of their guide to the European world. Kendall had been driven to take part in this unauthorised expedition for a combination of reasons. First, he was deeply unhappy with life in the missionary settlement at Rangihaua. His relationships with the other missionaries was dysfunctional and his marriage had collapsed. Second, he was looking for more authority. He wanted to be ordained as a priest so he could act more independently when he returned to Aotearoa. But maybe most of all, Kendall wanted to work on his dictionary of Te Reo Maori. As religious history professor Peter Lynham says, this was something Kendall had been working on for 6 years.
Kendall is a remarkable man in his grammatical understanding, given that he's come from a very, relatively simple primary school background as a teacher, that he compiles a grammar for the Maori language, which is in draft even before he arrives in New Zealand.
This is something which is kind of hard to explain in a podcast format, but one of the weirdest things in reading early European writings about New Zealand is how Maori words are spelled. Like Hongi, for example, his name is generally spelled Shungee, while his nephew Ruatara is spelled Duaterra. And if you want a really extreme one, there's a passage from one of James Cook's expeditions where the Māori name for fantail, piwakawaka, is spelled Diggowwaghwagh. So it kind of looks like it's meant to be pronounced Diggowwagwag or Diggawawa or something. It kind of hurts your brain reading the spelling. But up to this point, to be fair, there was really no other way to write Māori words. You just had to sort of spell them out phonetically like they sounded to you. But Thomas Kendall, who spoke and understood Te Reo Maori probably better than any European before him, realised this approach was doomed to failure in the long run, especially from the perspective of Māori readers. Because just imagine that there's a word which has yet to be added to a phonetic dictionary of Te Reo Maori, which a Māori person is trying to write. How are they supposed to know how to spell that word so an English person could read it? Keep in mind that at this point, only a tiny handful of Māori could speak English, let alone read it. So they just had no conception of how English people pronounced different letters. So instead, Kendall proposed an approach where specific letters represented specific sounds within Māori speech, not within English speech. This went through a fair bit of iteration, but it eventually landed on the system which we still use today. 5 vowels, R, E, I, O, U, 8 consonants and 2 digraphs. That's, WH for F and NG for Ng. Kendall also recognised the importance of long and short vowels. So, tangata means person, whereas tangata means people.
His work on linguistic analysis is extraordinary for a person who's effectively making it up as he goes along. And Lee is very reluctant to acknowledge that a man of limited education could have got so far. But in the end, he works with the system that Kendall has devised.
The Lee that Peter Lynam's referring to here is Professor Samuel Lee. He was a former missionary turned professor of linguistics at Cambridge University. And a big part of why Kendall sailed for London was to work with Lee, Hongi and Waikato to refine and expand his system into a full written dictionary and grammar. Now, the main purpose of creating this dictionary was as a first step towards translating the Bible. Kendall, remember, is a missionary. But Ngāti Rāroa Kaumātua Hāmi Piripi thinks Kendall also understood how literacy could empower Māori in other ways.
He realised the power of it, you see, because once we were able to communicate in English, we would have a much better chance at navigating our way into the future. Hongi, for example, instructed his nephew to learn to read and write in English because he knew that if he never had a scribe, he had nothing.
So Kendall gets to work with Hongi, Waikato and Professor Lee, and together, in 1820, they publish A Grammar and Vocabulary of the Language of New Zealand, the first ever proper dictionary of Te Reo Maori. Now, Hongi Hika was interested in this dictionary, but he also had his own motivations for travelling to England. He wanted to see the homeland of these alien people who'd turned up in his homeland and wanted to analyse what risks and opportunities they might provide. And, of course, he wanted muskets. Hongi would later trade many of the gifts he received from British aristocrats for firearms, but he also purchased several hundred guns via an exiled French aristocrat, Baron Charles de Thierry. De Thierry hoped to set up a colony in Hokianga, so he traded guns to Hongi in exchange for rights to settle that land, and he would eventually turn up claiming to be the king of Nukuhiva and the Marquesas Islands, but that's a whole other story. We'll have to do an episode about De Thierry at some stage because he is bonkers. Anyway, in her biography of Thomas Kendall, historian Dame Judith Binney says Kendall basically promised Hongi a deal like this before they even left New Zealand.
Kendall filled Hongi with the idea that he would find a good supply of muskets in England. If gun running in New Zealand could be justified on the grounds of necessity, incitement to go to the source of supplies reflects Kendall's increasing dependence on the men whose friendship he was intending to purchase. Hongi's strength and ultimately his independence made a slave of the missionary.
Slave is a strong word, but Hongi Hika did seem to have enormous power over Thomas Kendall. If he wanted to maintain his position as a conduit between the Māori and European worlds in the Bay of Islands, Kendall had little choice but to act as Hongi's weapons dealer. But while all this was going on, a letter arrived in London from Samuel Marsden.
Dear Sir, as a vessel sails this morning for Port Jackson, I embrace the opportunity to write you a line.
We started our last episode with this letter. Marsden wrote it to Kendall in the aftermath of the incident of the broken barrel, blasting Kendall and his fellow missionaries for participating in the musket trade. These accusations followed Kendall to London and ended up on the desk of the Church Missionary Society. The CMS grilled Kendall over his sale of muskets and all the other dramas he'd been involved in. On one hand, they were pretty anxious about the musket sales and Kendall's squabbling with his fellow missionaries and his decision to sail for England against their instructions. But on the other hand, they thought the support of Hongi Hika and Kendall's skill with the Māori language made him essential to the success of the mission. So, ultimately, the CMS not only agreed that Kendall could stay on as a missionary, they also ordained him as a priest, and that's even though he didn't technically meet the requirements because he couldn't read Greek or Latin. Kendall was thrilled, and in a letter he sent just after arriving back in New Zealand in July 1821, he even seemed to accept that he'd maybe acted a bit rashly by leaving in the first place.
My mind, I am concerned to say, was in such a state of affliction and disorder at the time I departed New Zealand that I did not sufficiently consider the evil tendency of such a step. I know I often do wrong, sometimes in the consequence of the wickedness of my own heart.
But the wicked, vicious squabbling between the missionaries in Rangihaua we talked about last episode, that wasn't over. And actually, things only got a lot worse. Some of Thomas Kendall's most poisonous letters in this period are about Reverend John Butler. That's a priest Marsden had sent over to Rangihaua in 1819, just before Kendall left. Here's Peter Lynham.
One of the motives that led Kendall to leave was that John Butler, a young ordained clergyman, had been sent across by Marsden effectively to put some constraints around Kendall's behaviour. Kendall comes back and now he is a clergyman as well, and he considers that John Butler is a drunkard, is uncouth, is badly behaved, and there's been much debate about the character of John Butler since those days, I might say, but that's his view.
Samuel Marsden, meanwhile, was horrified that Kendall had arrived back in New Zealand aboard a ship carrying some 300 muskets, maybe more, and that Kendall refused to stop selling guns. You remember those letters back and forth we quoted at the end of last episode.
You would have thought that somewhere along the line, Marsden would have stepped in and just dealt with the situation. But not only the struggles of communication, but also the key role that Kendall played in being the kind of middleman between the Māori community and especially the great supporter in Hongi Hika, lose that support. And Hongi's side, he was definitely on the Kendall side. So that's the challenge.
And Kendall uses this influence in some pretty remarkable ways. Like, I think he even tries to get local Māori to attack some of the other missionaries and, burn their houses and take property and things like that.
It does not bear thinking about what Māori must have thought about this ridiculous group. That's the only word you can use for the pathetic behaviour that's going on. Christian? Hardly. Mission? What mission? That was how it looked, really.
Then, in January 1822, things really heated up. You might remember that Kendall had left his wife and kids behind when he sailed for England, and that his wife, Jane, had given birth to another man's child.
His wife has had an affair, and he feels betrayed, his marriage has been let down, and then his eyes begin to wander towards a potential Māori mistress.
This is where Thomas Kendall really crossed the line in the eyes of missionaries, and actually in the eyes of some Māori as well. Rumours began to swirl about Kendall's relationship with a Māori teenager. Her name was Tungaroa. She was 17 years old and had been one of Kendall's students at the school. She had come to work in Kendall's house as a maid. It sounds like Kendall was spending a lot of time alone with Tungaroa in his house, and even overnight with her in the pā next to the missionary settlement. The rumour was that this relationship was sexual. Kendall's fellow European settlers were totally scandalised, and so were many Māori. Tungaroa was already engaged to marry another man, a rangatira named Tofi. And Tofi was not at all pleased that his fiancée was sleeping with a 43-year-old missionary.
Marriage and the status that it brought had to be very carefully negotiated. And Kendall, just for one who supposedly understands Māori culture, he flies in the face so much of the tradition that was so important to the society and Ngapuhi society.
In January and February of 1822, Tofi organised 2 raids on Kendall's home. The second of these raids involved more than 100 warriors. They burst into his house and they would have killed him if not for the intervention of another rangatira who blocked an axe blow which was aimed at his head. Kendall was allowed to live, and his reputation with local Māori eventually recovered. But many of his possessions and animals were taken or destroyed.
Well, you got to pay a price when you take a betrothed woman, and that's a tikanga Māori.
And as Judith Binney points out, Kendall's fellow Europeans were deeply alarmed, and that's not just by Tofi's raids, but also by the spiritual implications of what was going on.
Kendall continued, to the horror of the settlers, to take divine service at Rangihoa while living in the sin of adultery. The settlers huddled together, fearing contamination, and finally came to the decision not to attend Kendall's ministry until he put away the girl from his house.
The settlers decided to meet at William Hall's house and conduct services there instead. But Kendall wasn't going to stand for that. Reverend Samuel Lee described what happened in a letter to Samuel Marsden. By the way, this is a different Samuel Lee than the Professor of Linguistics back in London. Anyway, he wrote,
"At the time Mr. Hall was giving out the day of the month and the psalms for the day, Mr. Kendall came in, more like a roaring lion than a messenger of the Lord, and began the service again. Mr. King withdrew, and soon after Mr. Hall followed. I laid down my book and kept my seat until Mr. Kendall had concluded the whole service with a sermon, and he retired without saying a word."
So here is this extraordinary contest in which Kendall is very reluctant to admit that he has done wrong, and breaking off with Tongaroa seems to be almost impossible for him. It's a very drawn-out affair.
Letters flew. Each was more furious than the last. A missionary called Francis Hall wrote,
"The conduct of Mr. Kendall has of late been very wicked and outrageous. He has insulted that pious and worthy Mr. Lee with as much cause as he might have found to insult a newborn babe. He endeavoured to stir up the natives to break down Mr. Hall's fence and take away his property, but they would not obey him. He is living in open sin with a native woman and despises reproof."
But the coup de grace was delivered by Reverend Samuel Lee. On April 4th, 1822, Lee sent a series of lengthy letters to Samuel Marsden outlining the affair with Tongaroa. He'd collected testimony from settlers and from some Māori, including Hongi Hika. Hongi apparently said that Kendall had told him that it was, and I quote, "very good to have 2 wives." Hongi himself had 5 wives, so he probably couldn't understand what the missionaries were getting so worked up about. And to top it all off, Lee said that Kendall had actually admitted his infidelity to a visiting ship captain.
"Last night Kendall confessed the whole of his evil conduct. He said he loved the person and hated his wife, but pleaded, in justification of his practice, the cases of David, Abraham, etc. His brethren have forsaken him, and he is despised by the heathen. Such a miserable man I never saw."
Then, suddenly, in the middle of all this drama, in April 1822, Thomas Kendall vanished. He fled, first to Whangaroa and eventually over to Hokianga. It's a whole complicated thing. There's letters back and forth to Marsden. Kendall's living on a ship for a while. He wants to build a church. No one wants to help him, so he does it himself. And then he returns to Rangihoa a few months later in 1822 and apparently restarts the affair with Tongaroa. The missionaries are pulling their hair out. They even debate expelling Kendall from the community, but the vote was sort of inconclusive, and to up the ante, Tongaroa's father and brothers threatened to burn down one of the missionaries' homes if they didn't make nice. And clearly, in spite of all his transgressions of tikanga, Kendall was still a pretty popular figure among Māori at Rangihoua. With Marsden, though, no, he was not going to forgive and forget. He wrote one of his most blistering letters in this time.
What can you want a church for? Can a minister living in fornication want a church? What do you intend to teach? Is not your crime a public disgrace to the sacred ministry to which you have been set apart? I know not what to say to you. The deed is done. You have ruined yourself in this life.
Kendall's movements over the next couple of years after his affair with Tongaroa starts are pretty complicated. He and his family bounce around different places. They come back to Rangihoua from time to time, but mostly they're living alongside Māori. But at heart, he really just still wanted to be a missionary. He sent letters to Samuel Marsden begging for forgiveness, like literally begging, grovelling almost. Here's one from August 1823.
Oh, let truth speak one word to your attentive ears. Has not my situation been peculiarly distressing? Have I not been in a state of delirium next to madness? During the time I have been giving way to these foolish and abominable ideas which have occupied my mind.
So, what is Kendall talking about here? What is this state of delirium? What are these foolish and abominable ideas? I guess the obvious assumption is that he's just talking about his sexual attraction to Tongaroa and maybe his sale of muskets too. But there does seem to be something else going on. Like that letter from Francis Hall in April 22, it said that
Kendall seems in danger of mingling with the heathen and learning their ways.
In one of his letters, Reverend Samuel Lee reported that Kendall told a ship captain that he was induced to live with Tongaroa in order to, and I quote, obtain accurate information as to their religious opinions and tenets. The thing is, Tongaroa's father, Rako, was a senior tohunga, an expert in spiritual matters. And Kendall spent a lot of time talking to Rako about Māori spirituality at the time he was carrying on his affair with Tongaroa.
And it's not altogether clear which came first, because there seems aspects of both in the story, both the sexual attraction and the intense interest which may have been brought about by his isolation from everybody, really, that he spends his time reflecting on the nature of Māori belief and values. But it becomes a very elaborate, if a little bit ridiculous, attempt to develop a theory of the nature of Māori religion in which he's trying to find equivalents to Christian beliefs and especially Old Testament beliefs about the afterlife, about God, about the gods.
Thomas Kendall's writing on the subject is honestly kind of impenetrable for people like me who don't have a deep understanding of the more esoteric elements of biblical scholarship, and not to mention Māori cosmology. Like, he discusses the importance of lizards in Māori spirituality, and he compares them to the serpent in the Bible. He says the tohi rite, where newborn children were taken to sacred streams and sprinkled with water, was a form of baptism. He even claimed that kaitangata, cannibalism, came from communion. You know, eat this bread, it is my flesh, drink this wine, it is my blood. Taken, I don't know, more literally. Kendall also gets into some pretty esoteric ground. Like, there's one particularly mind-bending passage where he explains the different states of existence in Māori spirituality compared to sort of Old Testament views, or at least I found it mind-bending. Hami Piripi maybe not so much.
The whole notion he developed about the first, second and third dimensions of existence and that sort of stuff. I mean, if you look at it from an English perspective, it looks crazy. But from a Maori perspective, it's quite understandable.
Thomas Kendall had actually been struggling to process Māori worldviews for years. Like back in 1818, he wrote this in a letter to the CMS secretary in London.
My ears have listened to and have partly been infected with the profane and obscene rubbish contained in heathen songs. The latter I am under the necessity of attending to, for it greatly assists me in learning the language, and by writing down the themes of the natives and studying their true meaning. The study is painful, and like the study of the Metamorphoses of Ovid, tends to injure the mind.
So Kendall may have said that Māori culture was obscene rubbish at first, but remember who he's talking to, the head of the Missionary Society. He probably couldn't express honestly what he felt if he felt something different from that. Either way, his opinions appear to have changed over time. In her biography, Judith Binney argues that Thomas Kendall became so fascinated with Māori worldviews and ways of life that he questioned his own faith.
Through his relationship with the Rangihawa people in particular, Kendall discovered the strange ideas he wanted to learn transcended the relatively simple cosmology of Calvinist Christianity. Māori had conceived and seemingly offered to him a pagan system that surpassed the teachings and ethics of Jesus Christ.
Kendall put all this pretty bluntly in a letter to a friend written in 1822 in the wake of his affair with Tongaroa.
I have been almost completely turned from a Christian to a heathen by the apparent sublimity of their ideas.
Kendall's growing enthusiasm for Māori worldviews from 1822 onward only made him more popular among Māori. Many, especially Hongi Hika, expressed frustration and kind of disgust at how Kendall was being treated by his fellow Europeans.
Because what he was representing to his colleagues and peers was a perspective that they shared. He was adopting their perspective on the universe, for want of a better word, and not even in a challenging way to the theology. In fact, he was trying to weld together their theologies to make it work. He didn't see them as being the antithesis of each other, which perhaps was his undoing in the end. But yeah, and I think he was really the test case for that dichotomy between the fervor of religious puritanical thinking and the loose nature of Maori village living, which he preferred to live like. He really was a true believer in our view of our explanation of the universe. And I think he probably stayed that way until he died.
This is maybe the hardest question to answer about Thomas Kendall. Did he really abandon Christianity and adopt Māori religious beliefs for his own? His writings suggest he did, at least for a little while. That's part of the argument he was making to Samuel Marsden when he was writing his various grovelling letters. But Samuel Marsden refused to accept these apologies or the explanation that Kendall had been, converted to Māori religion. Here's how Marsden put it in a message he sent to the CMS leadership in April 1822.
Had I seen any signs of penitence, I should have rejoiced. But the whole that he has stated, in my view, may be summed up in the words of Eve. The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat.
So, according to Marsden, all this stuff about being tempted or corrupted by Māori religion was just an excuse for Kendall's affair with Tongaroa. I think that's maybe a little bit too simplistic. I think Kendall's attraction to Māori culture was genuine. I think he liked and respected the people of Rangihaua, and that his connection to them was probably, deeper than his connection to the Europeans in Aotearoa, including his wife. I think this sudden, scandalous affair with Tongaroa only deepened his isolation from Christian society, and that intensified his interest in Māori spirituality. But I don't know if I'm convinced he ever truly gave up on Christianity. And Peter Lynham is even less convinced than I am.
For Kendall, very much the demonic is thought to inhabit the culture, the heathen culture, pagan culture. So there's always an aspect in which he will be searching for where is the influence of the devil, of Satan. And in many ways, the evangelical mind is charged with these images of a life as constantly this kind of battle. So it will not be unfamiliar to Kendall to think of himself in terms of Pilgrim's Progress, that the pilgrim is always at risk of slipping away, of falling into the unmentionable abyss. And it may be that when he confesses this, these confessions are meant to say, this is part of my evangelical pilgrimage, that I will feel the reality of the despair that lies at hand if I should stray.
So you don't think it's likely that he ever genuinely did lose his faith and come to believe in Māori spirituality?
No, I think he saw the attraction of that spirituality, but my own sense in reading his letters, and particularly the later life and the way it developed, is that he's still very much within that evangelical framework, even though he's experimenting with what sense to make of the pagan world that he's come to terms with. And there's where I think he is looking at quite a different way of understanding that world than he was originally taught. And he comes to think that somehow there must be some signs of the divine in this. And you see, that too was not unfamiliar, because typically within English Enlightenment culture, it's expected there'll be some sort of intimations of immortality in cultures that have nothing to do with this.
By intimations of immortality, Peter means signs of Christianity. The idea was that people all over the world retained some fragments of the Christian faith within their own indigenous religions. And this is what Peter thinks Kendall was doing with all his comparisons between Māori and Christian religions.
He's constantly talking to Tohunga and trying to understand, how does this work? And to have that conversation. Well, we know of other instances where Hall and King tried to have this conversation, and it's like they're talking at such a distance from each other. They end up bemused by Māori beliefs and Māori bemused by their odd beliefs. Whereas for Kendall, much more detail is in his head. He is determined to find out the kind of panoply of the world that they inhabit, and I think that's significant, but I don't think that means that he abandons his faith. It's just that he knows that potentially he is a condemned man by his own faith.
So he's more trying to find a middle ground, do you think?
No, I think he's trying to recover his salvation. He's trying desperately to work out, God has led me in this path. What is God's purpose for bringing me here? Well, you might well ask that question.
I know that all got a bit esoteric. I guess the short version is this. Thomas Kendall's initial purpose in coming to New Zealand was to convert Māori to Christianity, and he stated many times that he only wanted to learn about Māori beliefs as part of that mission. So it is possible that in studying Māori cosmology and linking it back to the world of the Old Testament, Kendall's sort of building a bridge between the Christian and Māori worldviews, and that he eventually walked across that bridge. But it's equally possible that Kendall was building a bridge in the hope that it would be Māori who came across to his side. And ultimately, that is kind of what happened. While Thomas Kendall and his fellow early missionaries spectacularly failed in their mission to convert Māori in the early 1810s, 20s, that mission would ultimately succeed. Over the next few decades, Māori converted to Christianity in astonishing numbers.
I mean, between 1845, I think, 1840 and 1845, over 70% of our population became Christian, just almost overnight, because they had the power of forgiveness. And with the power of forgiveness, you're always going to come out on top. And that's what Māori didn't really have. We haven't got that notion in our arsenal, as it were. There's no such thing. For every action, there must be a reaction. There's no exemption.
By that time, the 1840s, the worst conflicts of the Musket Wars had come to an end. There were many reasons for this. One of the big ones is that by the 1830s, all tribes had equal access to guns, which meant fewer opportunities for easy conquests. And the growing presence of the British Crown also disincentivised intertribal warfare. But as Harmy says, there are many examples of Māori who'd converted to Christianity using this new faith to escape the traditional demands of utu, the concept that every action must have an appropriate response. Now, Māori did have traditional methods of ending wars, strategic marriages, exchanges of land rights, and so on. But the Christian message that you could enhance your status by forgiving your enemy, that was a powerful idea for Māori at a time when new technology had made warfare just so much more deadly. Remember, these wars have estimated to have cost as many as 20,000 lives. Thomas Kendall played a role in all this. His dictionary of Te Reo Maori is what enabled both the translation of the Bible and an astonishingly rapid rise of Māori literacy.
By the time that the first bits of scripture begin to be translated in the late 1820s, they are treated with such excitement because here was printed our own language, and Māori are reading constantly the enthusiasm that had once been there for muskets, some have suggested was replaced by this enthusiasm for reading.
In 1834, it was estimated that 10,000 Māori could read in their own language. Between 1835 and 1841, missionary William Colenso published something like 5.5 million pages of religious material. And between 1841 and 1845, about 60,000 copies of the New Testament were printed in Te Reo Maori. In this era, Māori actually had higher literacy rates than European colonists. They may have been among the most literate societies in the world. But Thomas Kendall wasn't around to see any of that. While all this drama had been unfolding, Kendall's defence of musket trading, his affair with Tongaroa, him vanishing off to Hokianga, letters had been slowly sailing from Rangihoua to London, and then slowly sailing back from London to Rangihoua.
the moment the first hint of adultery comes about, the British CMS office decides that he must be expelled and he must be removed from New Zealand. But it takes a very long time to get that message through, and when it finally gets through, he doesn't believe it and wants to argue it back, and that means months of delay. And the delicacy for the mission is they can't just remove him. They do need to smooth things over, and he needs to leave without causing the whole mission to be ordered out of the country, which it must have been very close to being treated that way.
And that must have been very difficult for the other people living in the mission, right?
It's galling for them. And so they need to bring in Marsden, and Marsden arrives, and then there's problems about war parties and the like that makes it difficult to arrange his departure. Kendall, I think, knows the inevitability, but for a Calvinist who ought to bow to fate and ought to bow to this is the will of God, Kendall proves to be remarkably Arminian in his belief that he can somehow find a way out of this situation.
Actually, Kendall got a weird last-minute reprieve because the ship he was meant to take to leave the Bay of Islands got wrecked just off the coast as it was leaving, and Marsden thought this was divine intervention. But finally, in February 1825, Thomas Kendall and his family boarded a ship called St. Patrick. They set sail from New Zealand, and they never returned. The Kendall family wandered for a while. They spent 2 years in Chile and then moved to Australia. Somewhat astonishingly, after their mutual infidelity, Thomas and Jane patched up their marriage, at least to some degree. Kendall was granted 2 large properties in Ulladulla, that's south of Sydney. He became rich trading timber and farming cattle. But none of it made him happy. He just wanted to go back to being a missionary. Kendall poured his heart out in a letter to his old antagonist, Reverend Samuel Lee, in 1829.
I have at this moment 2 rich and expensive estates, but I am miserable. In my rush-covered hut where you used to meet me, I was happy. The pleasure I experienced in the service of God, the joy of a good conscience, made me indifferent to poverty and dangers.
Samuel Marsden wrote this after meeting Kendall earlier that same year.
He appears as if God had departed from him and kept him without any power to withstand his propensity for self-indulgence, and at the same time appears to suffer the severest stings of conscience from the painful reflections upon his own great transgression. I cannot conceive the man to be in a more pitiable condition than he is.
But Marsden couldn't find much pity for Thomas Kendall. He wrote in an almost delighted tone that
he is likely to bear the chastisement of his sins to the end of his days.
In August 1832, a 53-year-old Thomas Kendall was on a ship called the Brisbane, carrying cedar and cheese to Sydney. As it sailed towards Jervis Bay, there was a storm. The next day, local Aboriginal people found the Brisbane's shattered hull half buried in the sand. Among the debris was a pair of shoes and a small wooden chest belonging to Thomas Kendall.
The fate of many a colonial, of course, that in the uncertainties of harbour crossings and going across the bar, so many people suffer this way, and the story ends abruptly.
So, in the end, what do we make of Thomas Kendall? I guess the first thing to deal with is the muskets. Sometimes Kendall's held up as a sort of arch-villain of the musket wars, but most historians, including Peter Lynham, say that's unfair.
I think that's ridiculous, to be honest, because there was a considerable trade going on between New South Wales and New Zealand. Muskets were coming anyway. The missionaries come to be a useful way of facilitating the import of muskets. But it does show how ambiguous their role was. They could find no way to create a sensible bridge into this culture other than a route chosen by the very people whom they're hoping to save from this kind of behaviour. Because remember, their picture of Māori is of dreadful cannibals and of cruel, heartless, harsh, strong people. And then they end up by augmenting some of those features of Maori society which were made much worse by the muskets.
The other huge feature of Thomas Kendall's life has to be the dictionary that he produced with Hongi Hika, Professor Samuel Lee and Waikato.
People have produced so many examples now of Māori from by 1820 are beginning to write letters, to conduct commercial transactions. It brings them into a plane where they can relate to European society at a distance. And by the 1830s, really, it is truly astonishing the extent to which literacy reshapes Māori society.
It is sort of funny from a modern perspective where literacy is so sort of taken for granted. But it must have seemed almost magical.
Miraculous, I think, probably is the word they would have used for it. I mean, Te Reo Waitangi, how would that have been possible without a culture that has become literate? Maybe it's in some ways one of the greatest fruits of the mission, that language can express relationship, language can express commitments, and language can be something that can be preserved for posterity. Very, very significant.
Back in 2019, I had the privilege of working with Dr. Melanie Chung on a program she produced about Māori astronomy for RNZ's Our Changing World podcast. I'll include a link in the description for this show. As part of this program, we interviewed Dr. Rangi Matamua. He's an astronomer who's become famous for sharing traditional Māori knowledge of the stars. And Dr. Matamua showed us the source of some of that knowledge.
This book is, 1897? What's that? So 120 years. 20 years old, this book, yeah. Very tapu for me.
And you can see the beautiful old-fashioned writing.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
It's all written in Te Reo Maori. These are all different stars and just their own kōrero about each of the stars.
Dr. Matamua told us that back in the late 19th century, two of his ancestors, a father and son, Te Kōkau and Rawiri Te Kōkau, both of whom were tōhunga, wrote down everything they knew about the stars.
And so they give 1,000 star names, 103 constellations. Every star has a narrative, a reason why it's called what it's called, when it rises, when it sets, how to read it.
On his deathbed, Te Kōkau handed this book to his grandson, who would in turn give it to his own grandson, and that was a young Dr. Rangi Matamua.
On his deathbed, my grandfather says, look, that book is sacred, written by the hand of a tohunga. I fear whoever comes into contact with it, if they read it, they'll be sick, because they were really tapu people. Yeah. But then he said, but the knowledge in that book, you're okay because you descend from them. You need to find a way to share that knowledge. Last words, knowledge that isn't shared isn't knowledge. So that kind of sent me off on a little bit of a journey for the last 20 years. And that's why I do what I do.
Across the world and across history, many languages were never written down. In many cases, that's meant knowledge has been lost, or at least not shared as widely as it could have been. Thomas Kendall was in many ways a black sheep, especially among the missionaries. He sold muskets. He had an affair. He seems generally to have been just a pretty hard guy to get along with. But maybe the most important thing he ever did was to share a technology, to share knowledge across generations. That's all for this episode. Black Sheep is written and presented by me, William Ray. Our sound engineer is William Saunders and our production coordinator is Brianna Juritich. Voice acting this episode by James Kane, Duncan Smith, Megan Whelan, Simon Dickinson and Colin Peacock. Our executive producer is Tim Watkin. To make sure you never miss an episode of Black Sheep, be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you found this podcast. Mā te wā.